Cyberpunk 2077 is a game I was looking forward to for a long time. Not as far back as their initial teaser back in 2012, as I operate under the no game, no hype rules. Meaning, if all you have to show me is a cinematic trailer or just a title, I couldn't give two shits. Come back to me when you have actual gameplay. My excitement for Cyberpunk didn't really start until the original 48-minute gameplay demo they unveiled in 2018, which upon looking at, I thought to myself, okay, you have my attention. By this point, I have already played The Witcher 3 and its respective expansions, and fell in love with it. I was not expecting The Witcher 3 to be as good as it turned out to be, especially since I never heard of the Witcher series beforehand. So naturally, my expectations were very high at first. And I will admit, for a while, I did get swept up in a hype train that many of us fall for. After all, I'm a big fan of the cyberpunk genre. I love movies and shows like Blade Runner and Altered Carbon, well, season 1 at least, another video for another time. And Deus Ex Human Revolution is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. However, as we got closer and closer to the release date, more and more warning signs were popping up. The original game demo was only available to press at E3 behind closed doors, which later became available to anyone attending E3 2019. Huh, well, that's just standard procedure for games so early in development. There were rumors circulating that the initial delay from April to September was due to the PS4 and Xbox versions running poorly. Oh, please, I'm sure they just needed more time to polish the game as a whole. It'll be okay. The footage they kept showing was only PC footage, with no console footage anywhere in sight. Huh, well, that's strange, but I'm sure everything is fine. The game is delayed again, from September to November. Oh, for God's sake! As we got closer to the November release date, people are wondering, when will we see the game running on the consoles? On October 5th, we get the announcement that the game has gone gold, and man oh man are people excited, practically losing their minds. They're getting the hype train started, calling off days, even weeks off of work in advance. Nothing will stand between them and the game they waited 8 years for. However, at this point, we've still yet to see any PS4 or Xbox One footage. It's a bit odd, isn't it? And then October 27th comes around, where it's announced via a tweet that the game will be delayed by 21 days. Bruh. What? What do you mean another delay? That went gold a couple weeks ago, just release it! The denizens of the internet's underbelly screeched at the top of their lungs. Fast forward to November 17th, where we finally see footage of the game running on the Xbox One X and Series X. And I gotta say, not looking too bad. I guess this is why they delayed the game so much. However, naturally at this point, people are suspicious of the new release date. I mean, I want to believe you, but I don't know. You've already delayed the game twice. At which point CD Projekt doubles down, stating the game will be launching on December 10th. Well, okay, but I've got my eyes on you. On November 26th, GamesRadar publishes an article titled Cyberpunk 2077 runs surprisingly well on current-gen consoles, according to CD Projekt Red CEO Adam Kaczynski, in which he said that the performance on the base PS4 and Xbox One hardware is surprisingly good for such a huge world. And although the performance is lower than their Pro counterparts, it's still surprisingly good. Hold on to that statement, I'm not done with it yet. The date is December 4th, and the review embargo is set to lift on December 7th. And there seems to be a problem. Most major review outlets have yet to receive their review copies. Well, that doesn't bode well. How can we expect to finish our review in time for launch day if we still don't have our review codes? It is worth noting that at this point a couple reviewers did state they got their copy, but most were left hanging for the time being. In the next few days, reviewers started getting their copies and were off to the races, trying their damnedest to get to the end so they can release a review on the embargo list for that sweet, sweet ad revenue. Fast forward to December 7th, the embargo is lifted and a couple reviews have started to come out. And people are loving it. The score sits at a 91 on Metacritic from the critic review scores. Hey, not too bad. However, in comes two reviews from Youngya and SkillUp, in which they start off the reviews that not only will they not be receiving a review code for the console versions, But furthermore, they were not allowed to use their own footage for the review and were only allowed to use B-roll footage provided by CD Projekt. Now at this point, you're probably wondering why, as everyone else would be. Well, as it turns out, the game was a buggy mess. They detailed multiple issues, such as enemy AI not behaving as they should, falling through the world, several points where a mission would bug out, rendering it incompletable, forcing a trip back to the menu, dialogue either overlapping or simply not playing. It was an absolute nightmare. And this was just the PC version. However, in spite of these issues, they did have a positive view on the actual content. Fanboys then took to the streets claiming that the day one patch would solve everything. You'll see, you'll all see. The day is finally here. December 9th, 4 PM. The game was unlocked for me. I navigated to the Steam page and clicked play, and was met with a day one patch download, as were many others. In fact, there were so many people waiting that they broke records for active players on a single player game on Steam. However, the ride isn't over yet. Hey, remember that article I mentioned a couple minutes back about the state of the game on the base consoles? Well, as people started up their copies on PS4 and Xbox One, they started noticing a couple things. The frame rate is pretty bad. Unable to keep a stable 30 FPS in the more active parts of the city. Major pop-in issues, game crashes, and blurry visuals caused by the game running between 720 and 900p resolution. Needless to say, the state of the game on base consoles is absolutely unacceptable. Especially since the console footage they showed off a few weeks prior were nothing close to what they actually looked to run at. Hell, the game doesn't even look that good on most PC rigs unless you have an absolute monster of a rig. In fact, the console versions were so bad, they not only issued an apology, but also urged people to get refunds through Sony and Microsoft. Apparently without their permission. Because Sony was rejecting refunds, which in turn gaslit many consumers and eventually led to Sony not only offering full refunds no matter the situation, but they also delisted the game from their storefront. A feat not even Anthem or Fallout 76 achieved. And according to a conference call transcript they put out, they were under, and I quote, "no external pressure to release the game this year." Okay, so let me get this straight. You've seen the game was having major issues with running on the base consoles. I'm sure the devs were telling you the game was not ready to ship. You state you felt no pressure from either the community or shareholders to release this year. And decide, fuck it, let's go ahead and launch it as is. But not only that, but you also barred reviewers from showing their own footage of all the bugs and issues with the game, and refused to give out console review codes to reviewers. Classy move, CD Projekt. This is not a situation like No Man's Sky, where Sean Murray was an introverted indie dev who got way in over his head and overpromised. No. This is more like Anthem, where you intentionally lied about the game's performance and content, and it just comes across as malicious. But hey, at least you're giving your employees their bonuses despite the Metacritic score. Well, after the devs were basically in revolt against the management, and only if you put in a certain amount of overtime during crunch, to the point where a couple of devs literally asked if you were going to provide mental health treatment after the conditions they suffered. But hey, who's paying attention to all that? CD Projekt good, wholesome Keanu Chungus company. So the launch of Cyberpunk is an absolute mess. However, I do think it's important to look back on the history of CD Projekt, because while I absolutely abhor the way management treated their team and the release of one of their biggest games of the year, I do think some perspective on their history can help shed light on how this whole mess could have even transpired in the first place. It all started back in the 90s, where wacky triangles were king, and everyone gave a giant middle finger to fashion. Enter Marcin Nowinski and Michael Kaczynski, two friends in high school who wanted to make a profit from their passion for video games and began work on importing games to Poland. However, they would not have a real business until 1994, when they established CDP.pl, or known as CD Projekt, a company focused on importing CD-ROM software in the US. And for a while, everything is going quite swimmingly. In 1996, just 2 years later, they become the first Polish distributor to publish games with Polish manuals. They then achieved their first full-fledged localization in 1999 with Baldur's Gate, in which they found relatively big success, selling over 100,000 copies. According to Marcin Nowinski, they rented out an external warehouse where people lined up to buy the game, with a few wholesalers actually getting into fights over the product. They sold around 18,000 copies all on the first day for cash. They then went on to do distribution for global hits like Baldur's Gate 2 and Diablo 2, and eventually became the official Polish distributor for companies like Atari, Cryo, Konami, Microsoft, Sega, and others. Hell, they even managed to secure exclusive distribution rights for Ubisoft releases on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 consoles. Really impressive work, if I do say so myself. Fast forward to 2002, where CD Projekt found CD Projekt Red SP Zoo, a studio where they would officially start work on their first game in the next year, 2003, The Witcher. And while the first game found relative commercial success, selling about 35,000 copies in their local market within the first 3 days of release, it wouldn't get much international attention until they would release The Witcher Enhanced Edition in 2012 for Apple and Linux. Because you see, The Witcher kind of launched in a fucked up state. Bugs and glitches, poor voice acting.
Do that again and I'll get angry. Wouldn't want that, would you? No.
Horrendous combat, most of which they fixed with the Enhanced Edition, save the combat. Because let's be honest, there was no fixing that without creating an entirely new game or engine. The year is 2008, and CD Projekt just rolled out GoodOldGames.com, a new digital video game distribution platform. The Good Old Games platform was set up to revitalize old PC classics as well as enabling them to run under modern operating systems. However, as the platform kept adding newer games as time went on, they realized the name had become obsolete and rebranded it as GOG.com in 2012. And as was in line with their policy, games offered on the platform would be completely free of DRM restrictions and bundled with a wide range of bonus content. Now that's what I call pro-consumer. It's also worth noting that in the same year, the company underwent a reorganization, in which the newly established CDP Investment became the holding company of the CD Projekt Group, while the group itself was composed of CD Projekt, CDP Red, and GOG. Overall, a pretty consumer-friendly company, wouldn't you say?
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
In late 2007, CD Projekt starts work on a follow-up to The Witcher, a sequel for which they create a new engine for the purposes of the project named Red Engine. The Witcher 2 Assassin of Kings would release for the PC on May 17, 2011 to critical acclaim. However, like its predecessor before it, released in a pretty buggy state.
Oh, God damn it!
A pattern is starting to form. I sure hope they can get it together for the next project. In 2012, they would release The Witcher 2 again, but this time for the Xbox 360, which included a number of fixes to the original, but still overall pretty rough around the edges. Keep in mind, this is the same year that they also announced they had begun work on their second major franchise, Cyberpunk 2077, based on the cult pen and paper RPG game Cyberpunk 2020. The creator of the tabletop game, Mike Pondsmith, joined the project acting as a consultant. However, that was as far as the relationship went based on my research. It's worth noting, however, that it is highly unlikely they even exited pre-production on Cyberpunk until at the very least after the expansion Blood and Wine released in 2016 for The Witcher 3. And speaking of The Witcher 3, we then cut to 2015, where The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt releases worldwide on May 19th across PS4, Xbox One, and PC, with its first major expansion, Hearts of Stone, set to release on October 13th the same year. However, like the last two games before it, The Witcher 3 was a buggy mess at launch.
Oh, you gotta be fucking kidding me!
So, why bring all this up? Well, I think it is important to realize that every one of their games released until this point were all fucked at launch in one way or another, but were able to coast by on their writing as well as their size as a studio, only having around 100 or so team members for The Witcher 1 and 2. But as time went on, the team grew bigger, and you would expect that they would have learned from their mistakes. The Witcher 3 was a mess at launch, but people gave it a pass, because 1, the game underneath was incredible, especially in the writing department, but 2, most people haven't really heard of CD Projekt until the announcement of Cyberpunk and The Witcher 3. And while, yes, the first 2 Witcher games were successful, they were still relatively niche to the mainstream audience, similar to how, while the Persona series was successful, it wouldn't really hit the mainstream until Persona 5. However, after The Witcher 3's massive success, they were put into the spotlight, and unknowingly shouldered major expectations for their next release, Cyberpunk 2077. Which brings us to the game itself. As of writing this video, I have 70 hours in Cyberpunk on Steam, mostly on one playthrough. I was planning on doing 2 more full playthroughs with the other 2 life paths, but decided not to. Why? Well, let's start with that, shall we? Because while I do think that the core content is good, and I do really like the game, it's far from great and is not what CD Projekt told us it would be. When Cyberpunk unveiled its 48-minute gameplay demo in 2018, CD Projekt told us to expect an immersive open-world RPG that would be shaped around the choices we make. This is false. I would call Cyberpunk 2077 an action-adventure game with RPG elements put in. Similar to GTA 5, but obviously way more in-depth than that. Why do I say this? Well, let's start with the life paths. The life paths were meant to give the player a sense of agency in terms of where they wanted their character to start and how they wanted their character to be. However, the life paths only serve different prologue missions and unique flavor text specific to their background. Apart from that, it really doesn't matter what life path you choose. For example, take the Corpo route. This is a world in which the majority of the city would absolutely hate your guts for being a Corpo rat. However, everyone after the prologue treats you as if you were a street kid. Hold on to that, I'm not done with it yet. Why? There also arises the issue of characters relaying information to V as if they were from the Nomad life path, like when Jackie tells V about MaxTac, the elite SWAT team of the NCPD. How in the hell would Corpo V, or even Street Kid V, not know about these sorts of things? Especially since in 2 of these life paths they presumably lived in Night City for most of their life, or at the very least have been there long enough to know about them. And this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of ludonarrative dissonance this game has going on. Another example is when you're talking with Evelyn Parker. You can select an optional dialogue about Dexter Deshawn, showing you already met his acquaintance. But then the dialogue option that pushes it forward has Evelyn talking about Dexter as if she brought him up in the conversation for the first time. But going back to the life paths, V doesn't even seem to have a different attitude or way of speaking. You would expect Corpo V to be more well-spoken, maybe even more stoic in their approach to conversations. And Street Kid V would have more excessive use of slang like choom or gonk and would have hot-headed choices in dialogue. But nope, Corpo V acts exactly the same as Street Kid V and Nomad V. And this is why I feel they only intended to have Street Kid V be the start of the game. Because even though they're all the same in terms of delivery and mannerisms, if you had to ask me which life path makes the most sense for V's personality, I'd have to say Street Kid. Now, maybe you're asking, well, what were you expecting? The game to take into account every little detail you make and every action and every line of dialogue? Are you insane? Well, no. I was only expecting what CD Projekt told us to expect. An immersive open world where my choices mattered. And apart from the opening and 1 or 2 side gigs, your life path ultimately does not matter. Now, I don't like to offer problems without offering solutions, so how do we go about fixing this? Well, first thing I would say is to change V's mannerisms and way of speaking depending on what life path you chose. Corpo could be cold and meticulous as well as well-spoken, whereas Street Kid V could be impatient and vulgar. Taking it a step further, how about having your status actually have an effect on how the world perceives you, as well as how you go about missions? Going the Corpo route would mean you do not have as much street smarts and fixers don't trust you, making it harder for Corpo V to interact with these fixers. Hell, you can make an entire mission around just getting into Afterlife. Maybe you have to sneak your way in, or even access your Corpo contacts to strike a deal. And that could be another way to make the choice on life paths more meaningful. Maybe have it be harder to strike deals with gangs and fixers, but give you Corpo resources that will help smooth over the discourse or use Corpo resources instead. Whereas Street Kid could excel at intimidation on the street, but be at a disadvantage when dealing with a higher class of people. Even if the narrative stayed the same, giving players unique ways to go about it goes a long way in having players feel like their choices at the start actually matters. I mean, hell, the game is based on a pen and paper RPG, right? Why not have each of the 3 life paths start with certain proficiencies and certain abilities? The Corpo, due to his background, could excel in net running and stealth as they are always sneaking around doing background deals behind other Corpos' backs. as well as having a higher proficiency in handguns, as he would likely carry around one concealed. The Street Kid being expert in heavy weaponry and explosives, sacrificing intellect and hacking for sheer firepower, whereas a Nomad could be spec'd into coolness in hand-to-hand combat. Being a Wanderer, they wouldn't have access to many weapons and would encounter plenty of people, so it would make sense for them to be charming and have a killer right hook. Hell, it would even make sense for them to have a sort of proficiency in crafting and engineering, as they would constantly have to fix their ride throughout the life. I know this seems like a lot, but it really isn't. You would still allow players to level their character in the way they choose. The story narrative in its most basic form would still be the same. It just seems odd to me that they wanted an immersive RPG with meaningful choices and didn't even consider how they could have made the life paths more impactful. Now, let's get into the choices. They advertised the world as a world that would be shaped by your actions and consequences. This is also mostly untrue. Now, unlike the life paths, there are certain missions and instances that do have major repercussions for the endings. However, it's still a far cry from what we were told. So first, let's talk about the pickup mission. This is easily the most complex mission in the game in terms of choices and routes, and it's honestly a damn shame we didn't get more missions like this. You start off with a meet with Dexter Deshawn, a high-profile fixer that contacts V and Jackie for a potentially profitable gig. He explains that he purchased a bot from someone named Brick, the leader of the Maelstrom gang, and wants us to go and pick it up. However, it isn't that easy. There apparently was a power struggle within the gang, and a ganger named Royce overthrew Brick and took over as leader. It also turns out that Militech is aware of the stolen bot, and Dexter gives you a number to a Militech agent to contact her, as she may be useful. Whether you call her is up to you. Now, if you do call her, you two will set up a meet, and you can either go alone or bring Jackie for backup. When you arrive at the meet, she has her bodyguard hold you down at gunpoint and jacks into your brain and uses a lie detection hack to ensure you're telling the truth. She believes there is a mole within her organization that led to the theft of the bot, and if you play your cards right, she will give you a card loaded with money to buy said bot. Now at this point, you are left with a few options. You could take the money and use it, refuse the money and either use your own or attempt to steal the bot, or take the money and hack it, upon which doing so will reveal that the card is infected, which if given to Royce will release a virus throughout their system and signal Militech to swoop in and help you finish them. If you choose not to use the money, you will have to fight more of the gang members in addition to fighting Militech troops, which will also happen if you decide to hack the chip. Hell, when you're talking with Royce, you can actually kill him in one fell swoop, but will have lost the boss fight you would have with him later in the mission. As you progress through the compound, you can actually find and either kill or save Brick, a choice that actually has an effect on a later mission. And depending on what you do, the Militech corpo that greets you at the end will either be Meredith or Gilchrist. If it's Meredith, you'll unlock the ability to romance her later on. So yeah, that's a pretty complex mission, made with plenty of routes and decisions that actually affect the mission outcome and choices. Which is why it's so disappointing that the majority of the rest of the missions are pretty much on rails, which I think is my biggest gripe. This is an open world game, and most missions I feel like I'm on a track with no deviations, even in terms of dialogue. You'll mostly have one or two answers that will actually make a difference. Where's my dumb guy option? Why can't I make observations that can change how we approach certain missions and vice versa? One of my favorite things about New Vegas was making a charmer, where most of my interactions I was able to solve with my words without ever having to pull out my gun. They tried this in 2077, however, as far as I can tell, the only attribute that can actually change whether or not you'll enter a gunfight is strength. For example, let's take this side mission I ran across. I entered a diner to sell some items, and as I sit down, 3 armed men burst into the diner and attempt to rob the place. Being a character of high strength, I unlocked an Intimidate option and was able to solve the situation without violence, to which the diner owner thanks me and offers a discount. However, this is not true. The items he sold me were still at the same price. Why? Why would you make a route that would unlock a discount but only have it be flavor text? And unfortunately, this is how most interactions will go down. Unless you have a high strength stat, chances are you'll be entering combat. Cool just adds flavor text but doesn't really change any outcome as far as I can tell. Technical ability is just to show how knowledgeable V is. And honestly, I don't think I saw a single text option for intellect. I could be wrong, but I don't know for sure. My point is, why even have these types of skill checks if the majority of them don't actually have an effect on the situation? It feels as if they included it as a checkmark that make a game an RPG. Now obviously at this point, it is abundantly clear to me that this game is unfinished, and due to the crunch, they had to cut plenty of systems or gimp the systems in place. Which brings us to my next topic, the world. Now we get to the world itself, and on the surface, it's very impressive. It actually feels like a believable dystopian megacity that is filled with skyscrapers and densely packed streets. Some of my favorite moments were just walking around and exploring the city's distinct districts, especially at night, when all the lights are shining throughout the streets. Yes, Night City is indeed gorgeous. However, if you start to look long enough, you'll notice some problems. I've seen people going back and forth between the game looking downright bad and the game looking downright good. However, I think the answer is more complicated than just one or the other. I would say that the game's visuals are wildly inconsistent, with some areas looking great and others not so much. Let's start with character models. Characters you interact with in the story and side missions are fantastically detailed and well made, especially when you're sitting down next to them. When it comes to these characters, they clearly put a lot of effort into their animations, their textures, and movement to ensure they're as believable as possible. But the NPCs in the open world don't get that treatment. Most of them look downright hideous. Especially the children. I mean, come on, what is this? This isn't a child. That's midget Keanu Reeves. Now, of course, NPCs can't look as good as main character models, as they have to be loaded into the world in vast numbers. But I mean, at least put some effort into some of these models. Another issue I've seen while playing the game recently is a lot of fade-in objects in the distance. For example, driving through the city, if you're looking ahead, you can see certain sections of buildings fade in as you get closer and fade out as you get farther. And I have not seen any change to this regardless of my settings, whether I have it on low or on ultra. It will still fade in and fade out respectively. While this is likely done on purpose to help keep the performance up, it's still noticeable. Another complaint I've seen is in regard to the textures of the city, as they're all over the place. You can have the most immaculately designed building, but not 2 feet away you'll see loads of low detailed, low poly trash bags. And the food, oh my god, the food. Why? Why does it look like this? Overall, while I do think the city looks generally good, there are enough visual inconsistencies that I could see one coming to the conclusion that the game looks bad, especially if you're playing on a base console. Another issue I have with the open world is how unreactive it is to anything but your presence. Take this clip for instance. I decide I want to fuck around with these gang members, but I don't want to get into open combat. I also wanted to see how the NPCs in the area would react, so I target the guy closest to me and upload a cyberpsychosis hack to him, which essentially causes him to go into a rage and attack both friend and foe alike. And as you can see, no one cares. They all keep going about their day as if 3 men aren't trying to fucking kill each other, not 5 feet away from them. However, as soon as I pull out my weapon and fire into the air, then they all cower and duck. Which, by the way, is the extent to what they'll do. And as you can see, as I turn away, the game despawns them, and there are no NPCs in the area. Which is not a bug, by the way. This apparently happens every time you enter combat, presumably to avoid the player accidentally killing a civilian and getting the cops on you. Which brings me to my next point. The police system in this game is completely broken. The cop AI seems completely non-existent actually, because you can walk around with your weapon out, fire into an open area, or even crash into multiple vehicles and cops won't bat an eye. However, if you aim your weapon at a cop or a civvy, or even kill one of them, or just drive a little too close to them, a police warrant will be issued. However, cops don't seem to have any actual pathing mapped out, because every single time, without fail, cops will spawn behind you about 6 feet away, at which point they'll start shooting you. Unfortunately, that is all they'll do. As you can see in the footage in the background, I deadass just ran away and lost them. They will not follow you, They can't operate vehicles like the rest of the NPCs. They don't even radio for backup unless you raise your wanted level, to which the game will respond by spawning more cops the exact same way. Behind you and 6 feet away. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't CD Projekt say they wanted to have a wanted system like GTA, but with corrupt cops who will take bribes? If so, why can't I bribe them to look the other way? And don't tell me, well, it makes sense they wouldn't chase you in a world like this with how corrupt they are, because one, that's not even true in-game as showcased by a side gig, where when you try to stop cops assaulting a corpo, he responds with, this badge means I can do whatever the fuck I want and attacks you. And two, it doesn't change the fact that this system is horrendous and utterly broken. This is not a hill you want to die on, trust me. And to be clear, corruption doesn't equate laziness. It means corruption. And speaking of broken or non-existent systems, let's get to the gang system. In an article published by Dexterto.com titled Why the Cyberpunk Gang System is So Important, they go on to explain the importance of the system as well as how your life path can actually affect your standing with these gangs. It's worth noting that this article was published on October 26th of 2020. In the article, they explain that Cyberpunk uses a system similar to Fallout's reputation system, in which your actions or choices could affect your standing with them. They give the example of killing too many gang members of the Voodoo Boys, they will eventually become hostile to your character. Wow, so this is just a blatant lie. There is no reputation system for any of the gangs in Cyberpunk. In fact, some of them, like the Mox, I've literally never encountered in combat and have only heard of them through certain characters. But let's talk about that killing too many could make them hate you line. I cannot tell you how many Tiger Claw gang members I've killed in my time with Cyberpunk 2077. In fact, I've killed so many, you would think they would be gunning for me, placing a bounty on my head, or just straight up entering combat the moment they see me. But they don't. They couldn't give two shits about their fellow gang members. And you know who else doesn't seem to give a shit? Wakako Okada. You know, the fixer who is essentially the leader of the Tiger Claws. She doesn't seem to care that I'm disrupting her various operations throughout the city, or cutting down her manpower. In fact, she's so indifferent to it that she not only continues to contact me for missions, but doesn't even acknowledge that I've slaughtered potentially hundreds of her men. And it's the same with all the other factions. The Valentinos, the Animals, Maelstrom, the Voodoo Boys, none of them seem to care about what the player character actually does to their faction. Their fixers will still contact you for missions, and will never bring up anything remotely resembling a reputation. The only reputation you have is street cred, which really does nothing except allow you to purchase higher tiers of items at vendors and unlock more missions. It would have been really interesting to have to forge alliances with different fixers, having the character primarily operate out of the districts they're loyal to, maybe even have faction-specific gear and rewards to encourage trying other factions in other playthroughs. But sadly, it seems this system was completely abandoned, which leads me to my next topic. Now, in terms of the main story, I will try to keep the spoilers to Act 1 and the very start of Act 2. You've been warned. As while I did enjoy the story, it honestly felt way too short. First, let's start with the prologue that leads into the first act. Depending on your life choice, you'll start in a pretty different state. Nomads will start at a small town outside of Night City, Corpos will start in the heart of Night City, and Street Kids will start in a more rundown part of the city. While each mission is wildly different, they all serve a singular purpose, to introduce us to Jackie Wells, our partner in crime. And here is where my first problem with the story's pacing occurs. In all three prologues, we as V are barely acquainted with Jackie, with the exception of Corpo, which makes the least amount of sense for V to already know. Like, seriously, why would someone with the status of Corpo V at the start even be doing with someone like Jackie? Especially since this is before they started working their way up through the underworld. But let's not get too into that, as it's not why I bring up the pacing. After you complete the prologue, you are then greeted with a montage that details exactly how V and Jackie get to the point they are in Act 1. Wait, what the fuck? Why isn't any of this playable? This looks exactly like what I wanted from the gang system. Earning your way up and gaining more and more lucrative gigs until we get contacted by Dexter Deshawn 6 months later. Now this could be me, but this montage seems like that was supposed to be Act 1. It would make a lot of sense too. It would give us time to connect with Jackie as a character, know more about him and his life, his family, the people he cares for, his beliefs. That way, the moment of his death would impact the player more than it did. I strongly believe Jackie's death in the heist was supposed to be either halfway or 2/3 through the game, but they were forced to cut out a third of the game due to time constraints. I mean, it also didn't help that CD Projekt put out a cinematic trailer that literally spoiled the end of the first act, but you know. And hey, speaking of wasted character deaths, what the fuck happened to T-Bug? No one seems to give a shit about what happened to her. I mean, it wasn't even clear what happened to her in the moment. I mean, I knew she got discovered, but I didn't know she died until someone else brought it up. Jackie gets a full-on funeral at his mother's bar, whereas T-Bug gets nothing, unless you count going to the netrunner she sent you to get a hack from, where you basically ask, yo, what the fuck happened to T-Bug? To which the clerk basically responds with, she dead, bruh. And that's it. This is a character that Jackie and V knew for a while. So long, in fact, that in the Sandra Dorset mission, Jackie and V act like she's part of the gang, like a close comrade. But V couldn't give two shits about what happened to her. The entire first act and prologue feels incredibly rushed and poorly paced, which is reflected by the number of story missions that are actually in the game. So in the prologue, you have 3 missions. In Act 1, you have 6. And in Act 2, you have 7. 3 of which are mission chains with 3 or 4 missions after the first, but are all tied to the quest they started in, and then the ending. So when I heard people were beating the story within 18 hours, I thought they were just blazing through it, but no, not at all. I've reached the point of no return, aka the final mission chain, 34 hours in, and I know for a fact I spent at least 17 of those hours just running around doing side missions and exploring. So yeah, oddly short for an RPG. However, they meant for it to be replayable, right? That's why it's so short. Except I don't believe that, because there are really only 2 missions that affect your options for the endings, of which there are 5 official endings. Now in fairness, most of these endings, there was a choice at the end, so it's really more like 9, but I'm specifically talking about the endings that give you an achievement. And no matter which ending you choose in the one that gives you a choice, you still get the same achievement you would have had you chosen the other option. The only ones that will give you a choice in how you go about the final mission are Pan Am's and Rogue's side mission chains. There is a secret ending you can get if Johnny's like meter, for lack of a better term, to 70% by doing all the things he wants you to do. Overall, while I liked the story for Cyberpunk and felt the dynamic between Johnny and V was compelling, it's definitely nowhere near as strong as The Witcher 3's, and I can't help but feel disappointed in the end product, especially since I genuinely like some of the side characters who never got any attention in the main quest, like River Ward or Carrie Eurodyne. Hell, even the Delamain quest outcome doesn't really do much for the main story, which is why I feel they abandoned the world shaped by your choices idea because it proved too daunting for them to achieve in the time they had. However, let's move on to the gameplay and combat portion of the video, shall we? In a recent EFAP stream, one of the hosts, Rags, made a comment that really resonated with me and my experience with the game. He said Cyberpunk 2077 is basically, it's like this, but not as good. Meaning, the game is an amalgamation of several different game ideas all rolled into one package. Oh, the gunplay is kind of like Call of Duty, but not as good. Oh, the hacking and stealth is like Deus Ex, but not as good. Oh, you have dialogue choices like Fallout, but not as good. Oh, the driving system is like GTA, but not as good. Because you see, while Cyberpunk does a lot of things, it doesn't really do any of them particularly well. Let's start with the character customization. There's no other way to say this. The character creator sucks. The options available to you are surprisingly limited. There are no sliders for you to customize to your liking, there is no color wheel, and the cyberware options are a joke, limited only to your head. Why? Why would you tout how great your customization is when you really cannot make any major alterations to your character's appearance apart from some shiny metal lines on your face? I mean, for fuck's sake, Demon X Machina had a more robust character creator. In that game, certain upgrades would swap out your legs, your eyes, your goddamn arms for something completely mechanical. And you end up looking more cyberpunk than you ever do in 2077. They also commit the cardinal sin when it comes to hair color. Take a look at this clip. I am highlighting what is supposed to be white, but the hair doesn't look white. Same with brown. They both look slightly greenish. However, when you enter the game, it's clear white as if you were 90 years old. Why? Well, because of the lighting in the character creator. The first rule when it comes to character creators is to always have multiple background lighting, as different lighting can affect how different colors can look. Also, I hope you were satisfied with your creation, because once you're in game, there's no changing it. What the fuck? Why? This is a future where body modification is as simple and common as going to the dentist. You couldn't at least give people the option to change their hair? This wasn't Witcher 3, for God's sake. I look at characters like the Maelstrom or the Mox and think, why can't I make myself look like that? Why can't I look as crazy or as simple as I want to be in a goddamn Cyberpunk game? I think I said enough on the character creator. I don't like it, and I wonder why they even bothered including it, considering how V is really more their own character rather than the players. So let's move on to the next topic. Let's talk about the gunplay in combat. Now personally, I like it. I like how the guns feel. I like the carnage you can inflict. But some people are acting like it's either the best combat system or the worst, and it's really neither. It's okay. The combat is better than Witcher 3's, but just barely. And while guns do feel good, melee feels rather unrefined. None of the melee weapons have weight to their attacks. It's like I'm playing Skyrim again. Which isn't necessarily bad, but I would have expected more from a game that came out 9 years later. And then you have the different types of weapons, which by the end of the game really kind of baffled me in why they even included them. So in short, you have 3 types of weapons: power weapons, tech weapons, and smart weapons. And the idea is they are made to tailor to certain playstyles, but I don't think the game really expands on this idea. Smart weapons are essentially auto-aim guns. Think the smart pistol in Titanfall, but for all types of weapons. And I will admit, it's pretty cool to shoot a smart shotgun shot in the air and watch the bullets just fly towards some poor bastard. But eventually, I just stopped using them because they didn't do as much damage as power weapons, but also the novelty wasn't worth the lower DPS. And let's be clear too, while I mostly use power weapons save for one tech weapon, I'm not saying power weapons perk is better. In fact, it's so bad, I genuinely forgot it existed for the majority of my playthrough. So, the power weapon special perk is the bullets have a chance to ricochet, and if you spec into power weapons, you can see the line they'll ricochet to when you're aiming. It's another situation where I'm just, yeah, that's neat, but why do that when I could just, shoot them in the head? The tech weapons are the ones that probably have the most application, as their perk is you can charge the shot while ADSing to deal more damage, which seems significantly better and less of a gimmick compared to the other two. But hey, maybe these perks and systems would have been used more if the combat AI was up to snuff. To call the combat AI stupid would be kind. They are basic. So many times I would get into gunfights and the enemy would either stand completely in the open as I'm unloading their body with bullets, or they would all rush me in a single file line with no regard for their own lives. And unfortunately, this is the best case scenario. Take a look at these 2 clips I took. In one, the AI is so desperate to get into melee range that they literally trip over themselves or their teammates' bodies, which happens constantly, by the way. And in the next clip, their combat AI just broke, and they did nothing as I slaughtered them one by one. The most amount of difficulty you'll get is they'll do more damage to you and take more damage from you. Oh, awesome! My favorite difficulty system. Some factions will have netrunners in their group as a way to, I guess, vary up the combat, but they do the same thing every time. They get behind a wall or a box or whatever and hack you so you get set on fire. This isn't challenging, it's annoying. And it's rendered obsolete by a cyberware mod you can get, which makes you immune to burn damage, so netrunners at the end can't do shit to you. There's also melee guys who do a lot of dashing to try and get the drop on you, but they always dash towards you. They never try to flank, nor do they attempt to juke you, so they're not a big deal. Ugh, god damn it. What do we have next? Oh, generic heavy boys who use mounted guns. Yay. The combat AI is a complete fucking joke in this game, but it is an issue they can patch and fix, which I hope they do soon. Especially since stealth completely breaks combat encounters. So I'll start off by saying I did not really focus on stealth. I did start to spec into it towards the end of my playthrough, however, I mostly stuck with going in guns blazing. But even with the little options I had, stealth was completely overpowered. Due partly, once again, to the poor enemy AI, but also just what you can do if you spec into quick hacking. You have a number of hacks at your disposal to deal with different enemy types, which is appreciated. Unfortunately, I didn't really do much, so I can't really comment on specifics, and I don't really feel like doing another 30-hour playthrough just for this point. What I can say is if you aren't too keen on the gunplay, hacking and stealth seems to be the way to go, especially if you are a fan of the Deus Ex games. However, it is one of those situations where I wish the AI was smarter. especially since some quick hacks like the reboot optics completely break the encounters. You have so much you can use at your disposal, but the game doesn't really give you a reason to experiment apart for experiment's sake. Eventually, you'll just stick to using the most efficient method of dealing with enemies. Now that stealth is out of the way, let's talk about the UI and control settings because I have some major gripes with this. Let's start off with control settings, as I had a bigger problem with this as a whole as opposed to the whole UI, which has minor annoyances. Firstly, I have no idea why there isn't a walk or slow drive button on mouse and keyboard. It makes zero sense, especially considering there was a walk button in The Witcher 3. Do you have any idea how annoying it is to constantly have to stop and wait or move inch by inch so you don't overtake a character you have to follow? They try to circumvent this by having your character speed slow down when behind them, but it feels wildly inconsistent as I would constantly be switching between matching the NPC and going back to my normal speed. And then let's talk about the dodging and weapon holstering keybinds, because my god they are horrible. So, on mouse and keyboard, to dodge, you have to double tap W, A, S, or D to dodge in that direction. Why is this a problem? Well, if you're going to be stealthing a lot, there is no slow movement keybind, and you'll have to constantly tap one of the keys depending on which direction you need to move. And you will likely accidentally dodge in that direction, giving away your position. And for some goddamn reason, you can't rebind this. Why? Do you have any idea how infuriating it is to not have a dedicated dodge button? And as for weapon holstering, the way most games have it is to just hold down whatever button they want you to hold down. Usually H in my experience. But no! CD Projekt wants to be unique and will have you double tap the Alt button, which brings out your weapons. I want to say this works about 30% of the time. As you can see in the footage on the screen, instead of holstering, my character brings out the next weapon in the lineup. Now of course this is a much smaller issue, but it still annoyed the shit out of me that I felt it was worth mentioning, especially after 70 goddamn hours. Another major annoyance I had was that the skip dialogue button was tied to the toggle crouch button, C. And just like the last key binding, you can't change this either. As you can see in the footage provided, if I attempt to uncrouch during the conversation, I'll skip the dialogue. Now you can jump to get your character standing again, however, they'll go back to the crouching position within a few seconds. Then we get to the UI itself. Now, I'm not one to knock on UI designs, as they usually aren't that big of a deal. But I mean, come on. Look at this setup for your inventory. Look at all this wasted space. Especially in a game that showers you with unnecessary loot. I would like to not have to scroll so much just to see all the items I've got. It feels like it was made with consoles in mind, which is fine, but you could have utilized so much more on this screen alone that I don't know why you didn't. If you were to ask me what inventory system would I prefer, I'd have to say RE4s and Deus Exes are fantastic inventory screens, especially since it allows you to move things around and maximize your space. Of course, they can do this as they aren't as loot focused as Cyberpunk, which I honestly kind of wish it wasn't. There are some parts of the UI that literally seem unfinished, like the crafting menu for example. It honestly feels like there should be sound effects here when you craft an item, but there isn't any. At the start, I accidentally crafted an item 3 times because I thought it was bugging out. Although currently, I would recommend avoiding crafting, as apparently it can increase your save file, which if it exceeds 8 megabytes, it'll corrupt all your save data. And what is the dev's fix? Either make a new save or just stop playing. Are you fucking kidding me with this? What the fuck kind of solution is that? You had a QA dev spend 175 hours in the game, and you're telling me you had no idea this was even a thing? Jesus fucking Christ. Oh, it is worth noting that at the time of recording this, they did put out a hotfix that fixed this, but it's still worth mentioning. Now, let's get into the tool tips, because for some reason the game omits very basic tips you should always give your player at the start. For example, the game doesn't tell you how to open your inventory. Now, I've played plenty of games that use I as the input, so I didn't have an issue with this. However, the EFAP post brought up a good point. If you're someone who plays a lot of games that the default binding is tab, it can be frustrating when the game doesn't give you any indication that is not the keybind, and they should at the very least tell people what the keybind is. Not to mention, this is a loot game, so you'll be going into your inventory quite a lot, so it's quite annoying to have to reach your finger over just to access your inventory screen when you're used to just hitting tab with your ring finger. Now, like I said, I personally did not have an issue with this, but I felt it was worth mentioning. The last thing I'll bring up about the tooltips is they don't just omit keybinds, they also omit certain ability activations. For example, when I started my corporal rap before I realized it was a waste of time story-wise, I decided to focus on stealth. And in the stealth tree, you can unlock an ability that allows you to perform aerial takedowns on enemies below you. However, they do not tell you what button it is to initiate it, so I was forced to look it up online. If I had to go to an external source just to understand how my ability works, then you failed at creating tooltips to inform the player. So, I clearly had a lot of problems with the game. Problems that became more apparent to me as I was writing this review. So you probably think I hate it. Well, funnily enough, I don't. In fact, I still really like this game. Yeah, it's got a myriad of problems in terms of mechanics and wasted potential. But I would be lying if I said I didn't have a blast playing this game. And I think what we have here is a really solid foundation. I think back to The Witcher 3, and if we're being honest, only one of those games I consider to be great, The Witcher 3. The first game is straight up bad, and the second one is good, but has a lot of things that drag it down. At the end of the day, I think what they wanted for Cyberpunk 2077 was too daunting for a studio with their experience. They reached for the sky, but unfortunately couldn't grasp it. Especially with the unrealistic expectations and deadlines they had thrust on them. And I do think that once all the bugs are fixed, we will have a good game on our hands. I just don't think it'll ever be great. Now, I don't like to give scores, because I see it as an arbitrary number people will use to either stand or dismiss your entire review, so I'll say this. If you are interested in the game, wait a few months until they patch it, and don't play it on a last-gen console. I think CD Projekt Red can salvage Cyberpunk 2077. It's just going to take time. Well, assuming this class action lawsuit doesn't fucking cripple them. Wowee, that was a big one. Easily my biggest video I've ever made. And I hope you've all enjoyed this video. Now let's end it with a montage of all the bugs I encountered, shall we? Oh, and quick disclaimer, I'm sure you've all seen the clip of the car flying towards the guy out of nowhere. While this did happen to me in the exact same area, I unfortunately wasn't recording, so I'll be using footage from Reddit user Tomasvamos0529 for this specific bug. I'll leave a link to the Reddit page in the description. For now, enjoy.